Hi, and welcome to this vocabulary lesson because we are going to look at synonyms, collocations in context, and words that belong in the word family. I hope you'll stick around with me every single day, learn these 3,000 words with me. Relatively, relatively. Notice I don't pronounce it relatively, relatively. So the accent is on this I, relatively. Here I'm showing a picture. I have a small stack and a large stack. Without this stack here, this larger stack, I would not know that this is a smaller stack, okay? So it is relatively small compared to this larger one. Relatively means I'm making a comparison. There is something else that is in my mind. So if I say, it was a relatively good movie, then it means I've seen better because I'm comparing it to something else. Relatively is often a qualifier in a sentence. It means there's more or in relation to. Some synonyms of relatively are pretty. It was a pretty great movie. It means it was almost great. I've seen better. Rather, something, quite, somewhat, fairly, enough, sort of, moderately, relatively. So relatively with an adjective means to a moderate degree. It can mean fairly, somewhat, not extremely. The exam was relatively easy compared to last year's test. So notice we're comparing. We have relatively easy, relatively difficult, relatively simple, relatively common. It means it's moderate. When we use the word relatively, then we are not making a strong claim. We can say relatively high or relatively low. This compares a level. It might be higher than expected, relatively high. That means it's higher than expected other than the reference point. So we're comparing it against the reference point. Housing costs in this town are relatively low compared to nearby cities. So we have a relatively low cost, a relatively high income, a relatively small amount. When we say relatively in this sense, then we are kind of saying we're being objective. We're comparing, we're looking at it without bias. They're relatively low. It's often used in business, economics, and statistics. A relatively short or long time. So we would, again, we're comparing. She became fluent in Spanish in a relatively short. That means that it takes other people longer. She did this pretty fast. Not super fast, but pretty fast. A relatively short period, a relatively long process, a relatively brief delay. This often expresses surprise or efficiency when we put relatively in there. We often collocate relatively with speaking. Relatively speaking sets the stage to say when considered with something else. For example, relatively speaking, the project was a success despite the budget cuts. This signals the speaker that signifies that we are qualifying the judgment. Relatively speaking, I can say this. If something is relatively stable or relatively safe or secure, then it means it's more stable, safe, or secure than something else. During the economic crisis, government bonds remained relatively safe investments. It doesn't mean they were completely safe, but they were safer than other things in this climate. It's a cautious optimism. It acknowledges that there is some risk, but it's cautious and it's optimistic. Some collocations we use with relatively are relatively common or relatively rare, relatively young or relatively old. It means they're not completely old or completely young, but they're older than everybody else in the group. I was at a social event lately, and I went there with my daughter, and the median age of people there was maybe 25, but I'm 54. So in that group, I was really old, but they would be polite and say, no, she was relatively old because the rest of the group was so much younger. Relatively old. Relatively small or relatively large. Relatively inexpensive or relatively expensive means it's not completely expensive, but it's up there. Relatively unknown or relatively successful. There is a nuance with relatively. For example, if I say the restaurant is cheap, this is a strong absolute statement. But if I say the restaurant is relatively cheap, then I mean it's cheaper than similar restaurants. It's not going to be your cheapest restaurant. The task is easy. This is a direct claim. The task is relatively easy means it's easy compared to other things. Relatively always talks about a comparison, and it softens whatever it is you're saying. The opposite of relatively might be absolutely. The noun is relative. The verb is relate. We have a few other words that are nouns here that apply. We have relative, we have relation, and we have relationship. All of these words have this same root in here, which is relate. Relative is also an adjective, and relatively. Relatively is the adverb, relatively. I really hope that you enjoyed this word. Research shows that if you know 3,000 words, then you can pretty much say anything you need to say. I hope I'll see you tomorrow, and please like and subscribe.